Welcome back to Only Talk Sports. We talk sports every single day, or at least we try to. I'm Nurse Jeffrey. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our video. The Week 5 AP Top 25 poll in college football is out, and I'm going to go over the rankings after a wild Week 4 of college football that had a massive shakeup on the college football playoff race and the AP Top 25 rankings in general. I'm going to break down every single team's ranking, and let's get into it. Georgia's still the number one team. That's no surprise at all whatsoever. They're still garnering most of the first place votes, and they blasted UAB last week. As Georgia looked like possibly the best team in college football this season, who knows, because they haven't really had a tall test yet. They do play at Auburn next week. That's probably not going to be enough to really challenge the Georgia Bulldogs. For now, they're still the number one team until proven otherwise. Michigan's at number 2. Last week they beat Rutgers. They do have at Nebraska coming up next week. Michigan's kind of in the same boat as Georgia. The Wolverines have looked solid to start the year, but they haven't really been tested yet. And until they do, Michigan should stay at number 2 as long as Georgia keeps winning as well. Texas is at number 3. They beat Baylor on the road last week. They've got Kansas coming up next week at home. That could be an interesting game, especially with the way the Jayhawks have been playing lately. But Texas, they have 2 first-place votes, which is one more than Michigan has, but Texas still is at number 3 because more AP voters still have the Wolverines at number 2. But the Longhorns have looked really solid. They have that big win over Alabama on the road, and they're at number 3, which I think is fair. Ohio State moves back up to number 4 after knocking off the Notre Dame Fighting Irish in South Bend. That was a fantastic win, and Ohio State deserves to move up back to number 4 because of the fact of other teams' performances not being as good as the Ohio State Buckeyes performance. They do have one first place vote, and if Ohio State can keep stacking up good performances later on in the year, there is a chance they can move up back into the top 3 like they were earlier in the season. But I think for now, Ohio State at number 4 makes sense after their close win at Notre Dame. Florida State's at number 5, and even though they beat Clemson on the road, they did fall a spot because I guess Ohio State's win over Notre Dame was more impressive because Notre Dame was a top 10 team and Clemson was not ranked. But still a good win for Florida State to beat the Tigers for the first time since 2014, but they still do fall one spot to number 5, and I guess that makes sense. Penn State moves up to number 6 after they beat the Iowa Hawkeyes. They blanked Iowa, and the Hawkeyes have not been blanked since 2000. Their defense could not slow down Drew Aller in the offense, and Penn State shut down an already anemic Iowa offense, and I think that the Nittany Lions number 6 ranking makes sense because they have been one of the best looking teams in college football to start this season. Washington's at number 7. They blew out Cal last week. They could have beaten them by a bit more because their defense kind of laxed up later in the game, but Michael Penix and that offense was throwing all over the place, and Washington, and to their credit, has looked great to start the season, but we're going to have to see how the Huskies perform once they get tested in the Pac-12 to see if they are going to remain a top 10 team. USC falls 3 spots to number 8 after their struggling performance at Arizona State. They do have Colorado on the road next week, which a lot of people are hyping up still, despite the fact Colorado lost last week to Oregon in embarrassing fashion. But USC is going to have to play a better game against Colorado if they want to comfortably win because they did struggle against Arizona State, and I see why the AP voters moved them down. Oregon's at number 9. They blew out Colorado, as already mentioned last week. They have at Stanford on the road up next. That should be an easy win, but I do feel like that the Oregon Ducks deserve to be in the top 10 for that performance against Colorado, and there's 3 Pac-12 teams back to back in Washington, USC, and Oregon, and that just goes to show you how tough the conference is going to be for the entire season. And then you have another Pac-12 team up next in Utah at number 10. They beat UCLA this past week, and they have at Oregon State coming up next. That is going to be an extremely tough game for the U, especially if Cam Rising's not back. There's been rumors that he might be available coming up next week, but still, we just do not know. Utah did not have much offense against the Bruins, but Nate Johnson was able to get it done, and their defense was fantastic. So Utah rounds out the quartet of Pac-12 teams in the top 10, but I do feel like the Utes are going to have more offense if they do want to stay in the top 10 and beat Oregon State. Notre Dame's at number 11. They fall 2 spots for losing to Ohio State at home. That's not a bad loss at all whatsoever. They had a great shot to win, but they just fell short, allowing Ohio State to score on the final play of the game. I think only falling 2 spots is fair, but you could make an argument Notre Dame could have stayed in the top 10 because that was not a bad loss at all. Alabama moves back up to number 12 after beating Ole Miss and Lane Kiffin Kiffin last week. Nick Saban still has not lost to Lane Kiffin, and the Crimson Tide looked a lot better last week. They have at Mississippi State coming up next. If Alabama can start stacking up some wins and get Jalen Milroe some confidence, the Crimson Tide might not be out of the college football playoff race, and they can easily move back into the top 10. LSU's at number 13. They beat Arkansas this past week. They struggled against the Razorbacks. That's why they fell one spot. They do have at Ole Miss coming up next week. That's going to be a tough game, especially after Ole Miss is coming off a loss to Alabama. You know they're going to want to play tougher and be able to knock off the Tigers. LSU falling one spot, I think, is justified for their performance against the Razorbacks, but I think the AP voters did the right thing not moving them down any further for now. Oklahoma's at number 14, and last week they beat at Cincinnati. That was a pretty solid win. They weren't too impressive in that game, but they did get the job done. They do have Iowa State up next, so they should win that game, but you never know. This college football season has been crazy, but the Sooners, they need to have more offense if they want to be a threat to possibly win the Big 12, but I think the number 14 spot overall is pretty fair. North Carolina's at number 15. They move up 2 spots again after beating Pittsburgh on the road. That was a solid win, even though Pittsburgh has not been a great team this season. Still getting that win on the road was solid. Drake Mays looked pretty good despite turning the ball over a decent amount of times this year. I think that the Tar Heels have the potential to maybe move into the top 10 if they can get some big wins later on in the year, especially if they can get a win over Miami. But for now, 15 is a good spot for the Tar Heels. Washington State, one of the biggest risers from last week after beating the Oregon State Beavers at home. They move up to number 16. Big win for the Cougars, the winner of the Pac-2 showdown with Oregon State. They have a bye next week to recover. So Washington State could move into the top 15 if a team ahead of them loses, but I do think that the Cougars deserve to move up 5 spots after that hard-fought win. Duke's at number 17. They beat UConn on the road this past week, and they've got a big showdown with Notre Dame coming up next week. That's going to be an extremely tough game for the Duke Blue Devils. It might be their first blemish of the year if they can't get it done, but that will not knock them out of the top 25. But if they could beat Notre Dame, Duke would rise up big time in the AP top 25 poll. But for right now, 17 is definitely fair for the Blue Devils the way that they've been playing. Miami's at number 18. They won at Temple this past week. They have a bye next week like a lot of other teams do as well. Miami's looked solid this season so far, and they do have that win over Texas A&M. Just like with most of these other teams, I do think that the number 18 spot is pretty fair for Miami. Oregon State's at number 19, and it's tough to see them drop 5 spots. You can make an argument that they could fall to around 17 or 18. Maybe they shouldn't have fallen 5 spots for that tough road loss, but a loss is a loss, and the other teams were impressive that moved ahead of them in the AP top 25 poll. But Oregon State was very close to be able to beat Washington State, but they just fell short, and they have a really tough game against Utah coming up next week. If they lose to Utah, I don't know if they'll fall out of the AP top 25 poll, but they will be very close. Then at number 20, you have the Ole Miss Rebels. Just like with Oregon State, they fall 5 spots for losing Alabama. This one makes a bit more sense because they never were really in the game. They didn't get destroyed, but they did lose by 2 scores and never really were a threat to beat Bama. Up next, they have LSU. So Ole Miss does have a chance to move back up in the AP top 25 poll, but I think the drop to number 20 is more justified than Oregon State's drop to number 19. Tennessee's at number 21, and they beat UTSA last week to bounce back after the loss at Florida. I think that the Volunteers look pretty solid against UTSA, and they need to follow it up with a win over South Carolina, or they could drop out of the top 25. Florida's at number 22. They beat Charlotte this past week, and they've got a tricky game at Kentucky next week. If they lose to Kentucky, they'll fall right out of this top 25, and Kentucky will enter, but right now 22 makes sense for the Gators. Missouri enters the AP top 25 poll for the first time this season. Huge for Eli Drinkwitz's squad and for Eli Drinkwitz himself, who really needed good things to go Missouri's way to help cool his hot seat down a bit. Missouri beat Memphis this past week right after beating Kansas State, so they did not have a letdown game. They do have Vanderbilt on the road next week. Can't overlook the Commodores, even though they've been struggling a little bit, but Missouri does deserve to crack the top 25. Kansas does as well. They're at number 24. They beat BYU last week. They also beat Illinois, so Kansas has a couple of decent wins. They have at Texas next week. If Kansas can hang with Texas and barely lose, maybe the AP voters will not knock them out of the top 25, but if they get beat by more than 17 points, Kansas will probably fall back out of the top 25 again, but the Jayhawks are a solid team and deserve to be ranked number 24 for now. Then at number 25, you've got Fresno State out of the Mountain West. They beat Kent State this past week, and they beat Arizona State the week before that, so Fresno State is undefeated, looking pretty solid so far. They also have a big win at Purdue as well, so I do think that the Bulldogs deserve to sneak into the top 25, even though there are a couple of Power 5 teams that you can make an argument that could be ranked. And in the other receiving votes, you have Kansas State, Kentucky, Colorado, who fell out of the top 25 after that loss to Oregon, Louisville, UCLA, Maryland, TCU, Tulane, Syracuse, Wisconsin, Air Force, Clemson, and Texas A&M. A lot of these teams have been ranked already at some point this season but fell out. Others are getting close, like your Louisvilles and Marylands that are undefeated that could get into the top 25 if they can win. Kentucky as well. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the AP Top 25 poll next week. But I do think that the Week 5 AP Top 25 poll is mostly fair. There's a couple of teams that you can make argument could be higher or lower, but that's the way it's going to be every single week. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below about the Week 5 AP Top 25 poll. Which teams you feel should be higher or lower, which teams you feel are just right in the top 25 poll, and which rankings that you think are the biggest surprises in this week's AP Top 25 poll. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Like this video down below. Follow me on Twitter as well. Link is in the description, and I will see you next time.